Maps are curious objects. They show what someone knew at one time. They show the world through someone else's eyes. Old maps are particularly interesting. They reveal not just where things were. They show what people believed about the world. They show what was known and what wasn't. On a late afternoon in autumn, a visitor arrived at a library. The library held old maps. The building itself was very quiet. This was the kind of quiet that belongs to places where knowledge is carefully kept. The hallways had maps in frames. Some maps were behind glass. Some maps were rolled carefully in drawers. The air smelled of old paper. There was also a faint scent of preservation chemicals, the scent of history being protected. A librarian named Margaret was shelving documents. She worked in the back room. She heard the visitor arrive at the door. Margaret had worked in the archive for 32 years. She recognized the footsteps of genuine curiosity. She finished what she was doing. Then she walked out to greet the visitor. Margaret was in her 60s now. She had grey hair kept in a neat bun. She wore glasses on a chain around her neck. She had spent most of her life with these maps. She knew their stories like old friends. She asked the visitor about their interests. The visitor was interested in old maps. They wanted to understand how people saw the world. Margaret nodded at this question. She had been asked this many times before. She never tired of answering it. She suggested looking at maps from different centuries. Different centuries would show changing understanding. It was like watching knowledge grow. Knowledge grew gradually across a landscape. They moved through the archive together. They walked slowly past display cases. They moved past open viewing tables. The afternoon light came through tall windows. It created long shadows across the floors. The dust particles were visible in the light. Tiny particles suspended in the air. They moved slowly with the building's air circulation. Everything here was designed to preserve. The temperature was held at a constant level. The humidity was carefully controlled too. Even the light was filtered to prevent damage to fragile documents. Margaret showed the visitor maps from the 1300s. These maps were rough and full of empty spaces. She showed maps from the 1400s. These had more detail and more confidence. The coastlines were more complete. Margaret explained how explorers filled in blank spaces. Trade had expanded what people knew. Ships returning from voyages brought back information. Cartographers used this information for new maps. Maps became more accurate as time passed. With each map, the world looked fuller. The world looked more known. As they moved through the centuries, patterns emerged. The world was slowly revealing itself. European knowledge was expanding gradually. Coastlines were being traced carefully. Trade routes were being documented. Understanding was expanding bit by bit. People traveled and returned with information. It was like watching a photograph develop. A photograph developing gradually in a dark room. The image became clearer with time. Margaret spoke about map-making as conversation that stretched across time. Older maps informed the newer ones. Map-makers borrowed from their predecessors. They corrected the errors they found. They added new information from recent voyages. It was a slow accumulation of knowledge. Each generation built on what came before. Knowledge was growing gradually through history. This was how the world became known. Not through sudden revelation, but through patient work across centuries. The visitor asked about unusual maps. maps that didn't fit the expected pattern, maps that seemed to have impossible information. Margaret smiled at this question. She said there were always anomalies in history, always things that didn't quite fit. She had something to show them. But it required going to secure storage. The most fragile documents were kept there. The most valuable documents were stored there. The visitor agreed to see it. They walked down a hallway together. Then they walked down a flight of stairs. The lower level felt cooler. The air here was more carefully controlled than upstairs. The lighting was dimmer too, dimmed to protect the documents. Margaret unlocked a heavy door. They entered a large room. This room had climate-controlled cabinets. It had flat storage drawers. This was where the most significant maps were kept. Maps too fragile to be on display. Maps too rare to be on display. Margaret moved with clear purpose. She knew exactly where everything was. She moved to one particular cabinet. She unlocked it with a key. She pulled out a drawer carefully. She gestured for the visitor to join her. Inside was a map lying flat. It lay on archival paper backing. The backing protected the actual map. The backing prevented direct contact with the map. Everything was designed to protect. Margaret explained the storage process. The process was quite thorough. The backing protected from hand contact. Oils from human hands could damage parchment. Oils could damage centuries-old ink. The drawers prevented bending and creasing. Temperature was monitored constantly. Humidity was monitored constantly. When a map was removed, for viewing care was taken. It was done with cotton gloves, never with bare skin. Everything here was designed to preserve. These documents needed to survive. They needed to survive for future generations. She put on thin cotton gloves. The gloves were white. She carefully lifted the map from its drawer. She turned to the viewing table. She slowly laid the map out. She used both hands carefully. This was a ritual she had performed many times. There was grace in her movements. There was respect in her movements. She understood the value of what she handled. The map lay before them now. It was drawn on gazelle parchment. The parchment was aged. Its color spoke of centuries passing. The ink was faded, but visible. The ink was still legible. The map showed coastlines with remarkable precision. There were notations on the map. There were measurements on the map. There were details that seemed impossible. Impossible for this time period. Margaret explained what they were looking at. This map was called the Piri Reis map. It was named after an Ottoman admiral. The admiral created it in 1513. She pointed to different sections. She spoke calmly about each one. Here were the coasts of Europe. They were rendered with reasonable accuracy. Here was Africa. And here in the southern portion, a remarkable coastline appeared, a detailed and precise coastline, a coastline of a landmass that shouldn't be known, a landmass covered in ice. It was depicted with certainty, not speculative or rough, not filled with decorative fantasy. It was precise. It looked like someone had actually seen it, or someone had access to remarkable information. The visitor and Margaret stood quietly. They just looked at the map. Neither one spoke for a long time. The afternoon light had shifted by now. The lower level had grown dimmer, but there was light above the viewing table, light designed for studying documents. In that soft and careful light, the map seemed to glow. It glowed as if it held secrets. Secrets it was reluctant to reveal. Finally, the visitor asked a question. How did someone in 1513 know this? How did they know what this coastline looked like? How did an Ottoman admiral have this knowledge? Knowledge of a place far to the south. Europeans wouldn't officially discover it for centuries. How was this possible? Margaret removed her gloves carefully. She set them on the viewing table. She had asked this question many times herself. She had spent decades studying this map. There were several theories, she said. Perhaps Piri Reis copied older maps, perhaps maps or sources that no longer survive. Perhaps merchant networks brought information from somewhere. Perhaps explorers had traveled further than we realized. Perhaps they left records that were lost, or perhaps the map represented a possibility rather than certainty, a speculation based on geographical reasoning, not necessarily actual observation. The truth was, she said, no one knew. This was one historical mystery, one that remained unsolved. It was frustrating for some people who wanted definitive answers. But Margaret had made peace with uncertainty. She had learned over 3 decades of work. She learned that the past was rarely clear. There were always gaps in the record. There were always things we couldn't explain. And that was all right. That was just how history worked. She suggested they sit with the map. Just look at it for a while. Just let their minds work with the question. Sometimes answers came from sitting quietly with a puzzle, rather than trying to solve it right away. She brought 2 chairs to the viewing table. They positioned the chairs nearby. The visitor found themselves looking at the map, really looking at it, considering the implications of its existence. The afternoon continued its slow progress toward evening. Somewhere above them, the sun was getting lower. In this climate-controlled underground room, time felt different. There was no sense of urgency. There was only the map, the light above it, the quiet, and the question hanging in the air. Margaret began to talk, not urgently, but in the way people talk, when they are comfortable with silence, comfortable with words as well. She said that this question about the map was part of a larger question, a question about how knowledge travels through time. How does information get from one person to another, from one century to another, from one part of the world to another? What systems do we use to preserve what we know? What do we save? What do we let disappear? She had spent her career thinking about these questions. Every map in the archive was evidence of someone wanting to preserve knowledge. Someone had drawn these maps. Someone had taken time to record what they saw, what they knew, what they believed to be true. Someone had been invested in passing on knowledge, invested enough to create a physical object, an object that could survive, an object that could be looked at by people centuries later. This, she said, was a great human drive. The impulse to preserve, to keep alive what we know, to pass it on to future people. It wasn't always done through maps. Throughout history, people had found different ways to protect knowledge, different ways to keep it alive. She began to describe some of these methods. There were written documents, of course, books and manuscripts and letters, But there were other ways too. There was knowledge passed through practice, teaching one person to do something who then taught someone else. Techniques survived this way. They survived because they were performed again and again, generation after generation, each person learning from the one before them. There was knowledge encoded in architecture. Builders had often hidden information in buildings, hidden it in the proportions of buildings, in the angles of walls, in the placement of openings. If you knew how to read these things, if you understood the system, you could extract information from a building, information that had been standing for centuries. The knowledge wasn't in any book, it was in stone. There was knowledge preserved in symbol, a pattern carved into rock, a particular configuration of elements, a color used consistently. These simple marks could carry meaning for those who understood them. They could persist for a very long time. Weather would wear them down eventually, but for centuries they could survive, carrying their message. And there was knowledge in community memory, a story told at certain times, a song sung, a practice maintained. Traditions could carry information if you paid attention to what was being preserved. If you understood its origins, you could extract knowledge from practices that had been maintained for centuries. Margaret said all of this calmly, as if she were simply describing facts, observable facts about the world. Each method had its strengths and limitations. Written documents could be destroyed by fire or flood or decay. Practices could be forgotten if no one maintained them. Architecture could be demolished or altered. Symbols could lose their meaning if no one remembered what they meant. But some knowledge from each method persisted anyway. Some information survived despite everything. The visitor asked a quiet question. Why did Margaret think people went to such lengths? Lengths to preserve knowledge. Margaret considered the question carefully. She took time before answering. She said that knowledge mattered to people. Understanding mattered. The things you learned through experience, the things you learned through study, the information you gathered, the understanding you developed about how the world worked, these felt important. They felt worth keeping. They felt worth protecting. She thought people wanted something. They wanted their learning not to disappear. Not to disappear when they died. They wanted it to persist, to be useful to people who came after them. And even when the motivation wasn't so noble, even when people just wanted to protect secrets or maintain power, knowledge still got preserved in the process. The methods they used to keep things hidden often kept them alive longer than they would have survived otherwise. They sat with this idea for a while, looking at the Piri Reis map. The light above it was steady and constant. Margaret had adjusted it when they first sat down. She positioned it so every detail was visible. In that light, you could see the aging of the parchment, the variations in the ink, the slight irregularities in the lines. These showed human hands had drawn them. You could see that this was something created by an actual person at an actual moment in time. The visitor asked what Margaret believed had happened. Where did Margaret think the information came from? Margaret said she had theories, but no certainty. She thought it was likely that older sources existed, that there was knowledge from earlier periods, that Piri Reis had access to this knowledge. She thought the Mediterranean trade networks were sophisticated, more sophisticated than we usually gave them credit for. She thought information might have traveled further than realized. Through merchants and sailors and travelers, people who left no written records of their journeys, but she also didn't rule out other possibilities that someone had actually traveled south, that explorers in earlier centuries might have gone places that no one had documented, that ships might have ventured into the Atlantic and made discoveries that were never officially recorded, that the information might have survived through channels we don't fully understand. She said the historical record was incomplete. There were always gaps, and you had to sit with those gaps. You had to accept that some things you would never fully know. The afternoon had fully shifted into evening by now. The building had a different quality as the day ended. The bustle of daytime staff had ceased. The building was moving into its quiet evening mode. Only maintenance staff remained. Only after-hours workers remained. Margaret stood and suggested they return the map. Handling it for extended periods, even carefully, was something they tried to minimize. She put her gloves back on carefully. She lifted the map from the viewing table. She carried it back to the storage drawer. She moved with the same grace as before, the same purposefulness as before. She placed it back in its drawer. She made sure it was properly positioned. She closed the drawer carefully. She locked it. She replaced the key on her ring. As they walked back upstairs to the main level, the visitor felt something shift in their thinking. The question about the map remained unanswered, but it felt less urgent now. It felt like the kind of question you could live with, the kind of mystery that didn't need solving. Not immediately, or perhaps ever. It was enough to know the map existed. It was enough to know it represented something we didn't fully understand about the past. It was enough that it had been preserved, so people could look at it and wonder. They emerged into the main floor of the archive. The evening light was coming through windows now, a softer light than the afternoon sun. The dust particles were still visible, but they seemed to move even more slowly in this dimmer light, as if they too were settling down for the night. Margaret suggested they sit in a reading area. There was a comfortable space near the windows. They could continue talking if the visitor wanted. They found 2 chairs facing each other. They positioned them near a table. The table had some reference books. There were recent publications about cartography. The visitor asked if Margaret would explain more about how historians actually approach these questions. Margaret settled into her chair. She seemed to gather her thoughts. She said that historical inquiry was like something, like being a detective in a way, but with a significant difference. You were solving crimes that no one knew had occurred, if they had occurred at all. You gathered evidence, you examined documents, you looked for patterns, you tried to understand what was actually documented and what was speculation. In the case of the Piri Reis map, the facts were relatively simple. The map existed. It was dated to 1513. It showed detailed knowledge of Antarctic coastlines. Those were things you could verify by looking at the map itself. But the question of how the information came, the question of its origins, that was something you couldn't verify through the map alone. You had to look at other evidence. What other maps existed from around that time? What documents mentioned exploration or voyages? What trade routes were active? What information was being exchanged? Between different regions and powers, you had to build a picture of what was possible, what was likely, what was known to be true, and in the process, you often discovered that the past was much more complex, much more sophisticated than you had assumed. She talked about the period around 1513, the early age of European exploration. This was when European powers began to expand their maritime activities. Ships were going further, trade was expanding, information was spreading through networks that were beginning to become more sophisticated. But most of this happened slowly, piecemeal, without grand coordination. Yet within these networks, information somehow managed to travel. Merchants knew things, sailors knew things. People in port cities who dealt with sailors, they picked up knowledge, and some of this knowledge made its way to people who were in a position to record it, to create maps, to preserve what they had learned. And Margaret said she thought it was likely that the information on the Piri Reis map came from some combination of sources. Perhaps he had access to older maps, perhaps he had access to older documents, perhaps merchants he knew brought information from voyages, perhaps he had compiled information from multiple sources, compiled it to create a more complete picture. She thought it was even possible that someone somewhere had actually made the voyage south, that the information had eventually reached him through trade networks, through contacts he had developed over years of working as a cartographer, over years as an administrator. But she couldn't prove any of this. She could only say what seemed likely, what seemed possible, and what seemed less likely, based on what we knew about the historical period, based on the capabilities of the time. This was how historical work actually proceeded. You gathered what evidence you could. You reasoned about what was probable. You acknowledged the limits of your knowledge. The visitor asked if this uncertainty bothered her, if it was frustrating to have a mystery that couldn't be solved. Margaret said it used to. In her earlier years, she had wanted definitive answers. She had wanted the story to be clear, complete. But she had learned something. She had learned this was a misunderstanding about what the past was. The past was always incomplete. You were always working with fragments, always making interpretations based on limited information. She had come to find this comforting rather than frustrating. It meant there was always more to learn. It meant you never ran out of questions. It meant that history was an endless conversation with the past, not a series of solved puzzles. And there was something peaceful about that. It meant you could live with uncertainty. You could sit with unanswered questions. You could appreciate the mystery without needing to penetrate it. The light outside the windows was fading now. The archive was full of quietness, the kind of quietness that comes at day's end. The visitor could hear the faint hum, the hum of the building systems, the quiet sounds of climate control, barely noticeable. But once you became aware of it, you could hear how constant it was the building was working to preserve. Even in these quiet hours, the temperature remained constant, the humidity remained constant, the security systems remained active. The work of preservation never ceased. Margaret said that thinking about preservation fascinated her. When she was first hired at the archive, she thought her job would mostly be organizing, helping researchers find what they were looking for. But she had gradually realized something, realized that the deeper part of her job, the part that mattered most, was participating in keeping knowledge alive. Every document that was carefully stored, every map that was preserved in proper conditions, every reference that was catalogued, made findable. All of this was an act of preservation. She thought about the people who created these maps. Someone had drawn the Piri Reis map with careful attention. Someone had chosen what information to include, how to represent it. Someone had thought that this knowledge was important enough to preserve, and then centuries later, other people had continued that work. Other cartographers had valued this map. Historians had studied it. Archivists had protected it. And now, in this building, with climate control and careful handling, with research access, the map continued to exist. This was how knowledge survived, Margaret said, through the sustained effort of many people, across time, through a kind of relay, where each generation received what the previous one had preserved and passed it on to the next. You could think of all the archivists and historians and librarians throughout time as being part of one long conversation, a conversation with the past. The visitor asked about the experience of working in preservation. What was it like to spend decades surrounded by historical documents? Margaret said it gave you a particular perspective, a perspective on time. You were constantly aware of how fragile the past was, how easily it could be lost. You understood that the things that survived to the present day, were in some sense the lucky ones. Countless documents had been destroyed. Countless maps had been lost. What remained was just the fraction that had made it through, that had been valued enough to preserve, that had happened to survive, despite fire and flood and decay, despite deliberate destruction. But in another sense, you came to see preservation as normal human activity throughout history. People had engaged in this work. They had valued knowledge enough to protect it. They had created systems for keeping information alive. They had worked to pass things on to future generations. This was a constant thread through human history, and the tools changed. Medieval monasteries had monk scribes, and modern archives had climate-controlled rooms. But the impulse remained the same. The evening deepened further. The archive was now in its night mode. Most of the lights had been turned off. Only dim lighting remained in the corridors. Margaret said the visitor should probably see something, see the archive's evening routine if they wanted to understand preservation. They wanted to understand how it actually worked. She gave a tour of the building, gave a tour as the day ended. She showed them the climate control systems, the monitoring equipment that tracked things, tracked temperature and humidity constantly. She explained how the building used technology, used it to maintain the conditions that documents needed to survive. She showed them security cameras. She showed them alarm systems. She explained that theft and damage were constant concerns. Valuable maps could disappear. Documents could be stolen. People had to be vigilant about protecting these resources. They walked through the stacks of less rare materials. These were still carefully preserved, still kept in proper conditions, but they didn't require the same level of security, not the same level as the most valuable items. The archive had different levels of protection based on the rarity of each document, based on the vulnerability of each document. Margaret talked about the economics of preservation as they walked through the stacks. Archives were expensive. The buildings themselves cost money to maintain. The climate control systems cost money to operate. The trained staff who understood documents, they had to be paid. The cataloguing and research work required expertise. Expertise had to be paid for. None of this was cheap. And yet, societies around the world spent significant resources, spent them on preserving historical documents, not because it generated income, but because people believed something, believed that keeping the past alive mattered. They ended their tour in Margaret's office. The office was small and quiet. It had windows overlooking a courtyard. By now it was fully dark outside. The courtyard was lit by subtle lighting. The lighting kept the space safe, without being harsh. Margaret made tea from an electric burner. They sat with the hot cups. They looked out at the courtyard. Margaret said that working with documents like this, working with maps like the Piri Reis, had made her think deeply about something, about what we choose to preserve, what we let disappear. Every archive, every library, every museum made choices about what was important enough to keep. These choices reflected values. They reflected what societies believed about the past. The Piri Reis map had been valued by multiple societies. The Ottoman Empire had preserved it. Later collectors had recognized its importance. Modern archives considered it one of their most significant holdings. This reflected belief that knowing how people in the past understood the world was important, that maps were important, that understanding the history of knowledge itself was important. But there were countless other documents that hadn't been preserved, documents that had been lost to fire, to flood, to decay, to deliberate destruction. Margaret said this was one of the sadnesses of historical work. You became aware of how much knowledge had been lost. You developed a kind of mourning for the documents that didn't survive. But there was also something else, something that kept you going. It was the knowledge that the documents that did survive, the documents you had the privilege to work with, these mattered enormously. Each one was a connection to the past. Each one was a voice speaking across centuries. Each one was evidence of human thought and creativity and effort to help preserve these connections. Seemed important. The night was deep now. The archive was fully in its nighttime mode. Only the essential systems remained active. The climate control hummed quietly. The security systems monitored everything. The documents rested. They rested in their controlled environment, preserved for whenever someone would want to look at them again. Margaret said the visitor should probably head home. It was late, but she wanted to give them something. Before they left, she stood and walked to a bookshelf. She pulled out a slim volume. She handed it to the visitor. It was a scholarly article, an article about the Piri Reis map, written by a historian who had devoted years to studying it. She said that this article wouldn't give the answer, the answer to where the information came from, but it would give them a sense of how scholars approached this kind of question, this kind of historical mystery. It would show them the kinds of evidence that were considered, how historians reasoned about incomplete information. It was in many ways a model of good historical thinking. The visitor accepted the article and thanked Margaret. They walked together back toward the entrance. The hallways were dim now, lit only by subtle security lighting. Their footsteps echoed slightly, echoed in the quiet building. It felt like they were moving through the archive's inner landscape, moving through its preserved silence. At the entrance, Margaret held the door open. The outside air was cool. It carried the scent of autumn evening. The city beyond the archive was still awake, still moving with evening activity. But the archive had settled into its quiet, its preservation mode, its long conversation with the past. The visitor thanked Margaret again, thanked her for her time, thanked her for her willingness to share knowledge, share her passion for this work. Margaret said it was her pleasure. She said that meeting people who were genuinely curious, genuinely interested in understanding the past, was one of the great satisfactions of her work. It reminded her why preservation mattered. As the visitor walked home through the evening streets, they thought about what they had learned, about the map, about Margaret's work, about how knowledge traveled through time. The article felt substantial in their hands, a physical object connecting them to scholarship, connecting them to the thinking of historians across centuries. They thought about the Piri Reis map, lying in its protective storage in the climate-controlled room. They thought about Piri Reis himself, 500 years in the past. Sitting down with knowledge gathered from various sources, carefully creating something that would persist. They thought about all the people in between, people who had valued that map, people who had preserved it. They thought about Margaret, spending decades protecting such things. When the visitor reached home, they sat in a comfortable chair. They opened the article. The first page explained the history of the map, the history of its discovery. It was discovered in the Ottoman Palace in Istanbul in 1929. It described how the map was initially preserved by Ottoman archivists, later studied by Western scholars. It laid out the basic facts. The basic facts of the map's existence. The author explained that the question of origins, the question of the map's origin sources, was one that scholars had investigated for decades. There were multiple theories. Some scholars believed the map was based on older Greek and Roman sources. Others thought that medieval Arab knowledge, medieval Arab geographical knowledge, might have played a role. Still others speculated that medieval European voyages might have penetrated further south than had been officially recorded. The article presented evidence for each theory. It discussed what was known about the sources available in the Ottoman world. In the early 16th century, it examined what other maps and documents revealed about geographical knowledge. It traced the possible paths through which information might have traveled. But as the visitor read through the article, they came to understand something. They came to understand what Margaret had been saying. The article presented evidence and reasoning, but it didn't conclusively resolve the question. The author acknowledged this explicitly. They wrote that the origins, the detailed origins of the information about southern coastlines remained a matter of scholarly debate and speculation. Multiple explanations were plausible. The actual origins might involve a combination of sources. The author concluded by noting something, noting that this uncertainty was not unusual in historical research. Most historical questions were answered incompletely. Most mysteries involved multiple plausible explanations rather than one definitive answer. This was the nature of the discipline. Historians worked with fragments and incomplete records. They did their best. They did their best to construct reasonable understandings of the past. The visitor found this honest approach to uncertainty refreshing. It validated what Margaret had said. History was not a simple narrative of facts. It was a complex engagement with an incomplete past. It required patience. It required humility. It required being comfortable with not knowing. As evening deepened into night, the visitor sat with the article and their thoughts about the day. They thought about how knowledge traveled through time. They thought about how people preserved what they valued. They thought about the work of archives and historians and librarians, all of whom were engaged in something, engaged in a kind of quiet resistance against loss. The visitor understood now why Margaret had spent 32 years in that archive, why she continued to do the work, even though the rewards were often subtle, even though most people never appreciated what she did. She was part of something larger than herself. She was part of a chain of preservation, a chain that extended back centuries, and would, if she was fortunate, extend forward into the future. The world outside the windows was quiet now. The evening traffic had largely ceased. The city had settled into its nighttime mode. The visitor closed the article and set it aside. They sat in the quiet of their home, thinking about maps and memory, thinking about how human beings worked across time, worked to preserve knowledge. They thought about all the knowledge that had been lost, all the books that had burned, all the documents that had been destroyed, all the documents simply allowed to decay, all the information that had been forgotten because no one took care to keep it alive. There was a sadness to this, an awareness of what had been lost. But there was also something else. There was the miraculous fact that anything at all had survived, that against all odds, through fires and floods, through centuries of decay. Some knowledge persisted, some maps remained, some documents had been carefully kept, some information had traveled slowly, from person to person, from century to century, until it reached this present moment. The visitor thought about the people who came to look at these preserved documents, researchers like Margaret, devoted to understanding them, students and scholars trying to learn from the past, Ordinary people driven by curiosity, driven to understand how generations had seen the world, all of them in some way, participating in the work of preservation, participating by valuing what had been preserved. The night grew deeper. The visitor felt the weight of all this thinking, the emotional weight, the intellectual weight of engaging with history. It was a pleasant weight, the kind of weight that comes from understanding, real understanding. Their mind felt full, and yet calm. They felt the desire to rest, to let their mind settle, to allow sleep to come. But before sleep, there was one more thing. They wanted to do one more thing. They took out a notebook and wrote down some of their thoughts from the day. They wrote about the map, about Margaret and her dedication, about the question of where knowledge comes from, about how it travels through time. They wrote about the mystery of the Piri Reis map, and the peace they had found, the peace in accepting that some mysteries didn't need solving. Writing their thoughts down felt important. It was a kind of preserving, a way of catching the insights of the day before they disappeared into the fog of memory. It was a small act, nothing like Margaret's work, but it was something. It was participating in their own small way in the work of keeping knowledge alive. When they set down the pen, the visitor felt a sense of quiet completion. The day had been full of learning, full of thinking. They had encountered something genuinely interesting in the Piri Reis map. They had learned something about history, about how history actually worked, about how historians actually thought. They had met someone who dedicated her life to work that mattered, even if most people never knew about it. They prepared for sleep, going through the simple routines, the routines that marked the transition from day to night, the bathroom, the bedroom, the settling into bed. The light dimmed. The world outside the window was fully dark. Only the occasional street light, breaking the darkness. The world had quieted. Traffic was rare. Voices were few. The night had fully settled. The visitor lay in the darkness and thought about the day, the archive with its careful climate control, the Piri Reis map lying in storage, Margaret speaking quietly about preservation, the article about the map's uncertain origins, the walk home through evening streets. All of it seemed to settled into their consciousness like sediment settling in water. They thought about how earlier in the evening they had felt the weight of knowledge, how much had been lost, how much we would never know, but lying here in the dark, that awareness felt different. It didn't feel sad, it felt connected, it felt like being part of something that transcended individual lives, transcended individual concerns. They thought about the chain of people, the chain stretching backward through time, the people who had originally created the knowledge, the people who had preserved it through ages, the archivists and historians, the historians of various eras, and forward into the future. Other people who would continue this work, they were all connected through this work of preservation, connected through this work of understanding. The visitor felt sleep approaching. The thoughts were becoming slower, less structured. Images and memories from the day were appearing in that semi-conscious state, that state just before sleep. The map with its precise coastlines, Margaret putting on her cotton gloves, the viewing table with its careful light, the nighttime archive with its security lighting. All of these images were moving gently through their consciousness as sleep took hold. The mind was settling. The day was receding. The world was fading into the quiet space of sleep. And with it, the great quiet conversation continued. The quiet conversation with the past continued. Even in dreams, even in rest, knowledge persisted. Memory endured. The work of preservation continued in the darkness. Outside, the night moved forward toward dawn. Somewhere in the city, the archive maintained its careful vigil. The climate control systems hummed. The security systems remained active. The documents rested in their controlled environment, waiting for whoever might want to look at them, waiting to share their stories, waiting to connect with new minds, waiting in the patient way of old things. And the visitor slept, carrying with them the thoughts and images, the images of the day. The mystery of the map remained unsolved. The question of where knowledge comes from remained open, but these things felt right. They felt true to the actual nature of history, which was incomplete and mysterious and beautiful precisely because it was those things. Sleep deepened, dreams came and went, the night continued its slow journey toward morning, and in the quiet of sleep, in the unconscious mind, the work of integrating knowledge continued, the work of integrating memory continued. The information gathered during the day was being processed, stored, connected to everything else the mind contained. The learning from the archive was becoming part of understanding, part of the way of seeing the world. This was another kind of preservation, personal memory, the way knowledge became part of individual consciousness and stayed there shaping how a person thought, how they felt, how they understood the world. It was a quieter kind of preservation than archival work, but it was important. It was how knowledge that had been preserved in archives eventually became part of living thought in the minds of people. The night continued, the darkness remained, and in the quiet hours before dawn, the world rested, the visitor slept, and the great work continued. The great work of knowledge and preservation continued in ways both visible and invisible, in ways both dramatic and utterly quiet. The past spoke to the present, spoke through maps and documents, and the dedication of people like Margaret. And the present listened, learned, and in turn preserved for the future. Sleep pulled deeper. The awareness of time slipped away. There was only rest and the quiet dream work of the sleeping mind. The day had been complete, the learning had occurred, the encounter with history, and with the work of preserving history, had left its mark, and now, in sleep, this mark was being integrated, becoming part of the person who carried it forward. The night was at its deepest point. The archive was quiet. The city was quiet. The world was quiet. And in this quiet, rest came fully. Sleep deepened into the kind of sleep, the kind that was truly restorative, that allowed the mind and body to repair themselves, to integrate experience, to prepare for the next day. The mystery of the map remained, the work of preservation continued, and the visitor rested, connected to something larger than themselves, part of the great chain of people across time who valued knowledge and worked to keep it alive.